When you look at, the emerging forces in society that are tearing it apart, what are the biggest ones to you in your mind?
Well, certainly ideological possession plays a huge role. And I suppose to some degree that's probably misplaced spirituality. It's something like that. And so I've always been struck by Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's analysis of the pathology of the West, that we're still suffering the cataclysmic consequences of losing our religious grounding. You need some conceptual scheme at the highest level of philosophical generalization. You need some way of answering what is good and what is evil, and some way of answering what's the purpose of my life, and maybe what's the purpose of existence. And at that level of analysis, the only answers are religious. Now, you can debate the rational acceptability of those answers, but that doesn't matter. I'm talking about the level of analysis problem,
right,
essentially. If you're talking about such things, you're in the religious domain. Well, intact cultures, let's say, or traditional cultures, have a structure of ritual and myth and dance and music and art and story that frames that uppermost domain of conceptualization. And people live within that. When it's fragmented and shattered, as ours has been, people turn to substitutes. And those substitutes have all too frequently been, well, either a cataclysmic loss of faith in existence itself, which is a nihilism that has terrible psychological and social consequences, or the elevation of an ideological position to the status of a religious belief. And
right,
that's not good. And so everything in its proper place, you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And, the rationalist objector will say, well, there's nothing that's God's. And I would respond to that by saying, be careful what you presume.
Right.
Because something has to act there. Something has to exist there. And you fall into a religious story. So if with the critique you laid out, for example, of social institutions, you say, well, they tend towards corruption, and maybe they're so corrupt that only a fool would have faith in them. And that's a powerful argument, but it's essentially a religious argument. What it does is it takes the problem of evil. So it assumes that there's evil, which is the corruption and the power. Maybe you don't use the term evil, but it doesn't matter. It's
right,
still what you're referring to. And then it places it in social institutions, says the problem of evil is located in the social institution. Well, that's a religious claim. Right. It's also a faulty religious claim, and it'll twist you up and bend you around because it's incomplete. And I tried to detail that to a large degree in chapter 11 when I talked about, because you can find malevolence in your own soul. You can find malevolence in other individuals. You can find it in the social order. And you can find something that looks like malevolence or certainly feels like it in the natural world.
Right.
And if you only focus on one of those, then, well, it's very convenient for you. I mean, so one of the things I always wonder, for example, if you locate evil in the social world, let's say in the institutional world, in the patriarchal tyranny, well, then you found an enemy. Right? And then you found a target for all of your unexamined spite and resentment and cruelty and homicidal tendencies, all of that. It's very dangerous. And the more sophisticated observers, and I think you can make this case merely as a consequence of observing literature, more sophisticated observers place the battle between good and evil inside the human soul. And then it manifests itself in social institutions as well, but that's not the primary locale of
right,
the divine battle.
Right. And Christopher Hitchens, the late, great, writer, had argued, in a polemic, God is not great, that religion should be replaced by the canon of literature, that theology should be thrown away and replaced with literature, that all of our great lessons that we need to know are in literature. Do you find fault with that?
Well, the deepest literature is religious.
Okay.
I mean, that's what Hitchens didn't realize, is that if you took 100 great books and sifted them so that you derived one greatest book from it, then you'd have a religious text.
Right.
And it would deal with these high order concerns that we just described. And some of that can't be done rationally, which is partly why Hitchens would locate it in literature. But it's not just literature. It's also It's also located and expressed in architecture. You know, a cathedral says something about the structure of being. Now, what it says, you can't exactly say. That's why there's a cathedral instead of a description of a cathedral.
Right.
It's the same with music and perhaps particularly religious music, but secular music is religious music. It's just been secularized. It still has the same impact and the same message.
A lot of the religions seem to be less relevant to people because a lot of not all of their lessons and morals, which many of them are great, but a lot of them, the big three, let's take, which you have Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Christianity went through a pretty serious reformation. Judaism is a small religion in terms of the numbers of people. Islam is maybe potentially going through a reformation now in certain countries and other, it's politically. So when people look at these religions and we say the answers are to be found there, there's sort of a deep skepticism amongst a lot of people who look at, when people were following these religions to the letter of the law and when they had an omnipresent, force in the political structure of society, it was often quite an oppressive place, whether it was, if you look at like the Catholic Inquisition or whether you look at, modern day Saudi Arabia, for example. So there's a skepticism about those belief systems being incredibly relevant now. And then you arrive at this place where people start believing in, that they're, an other kin on Tumblr or whatever nonsense that you've had to go up against for the last 4 years. So it's like, what can you create or what can we put in that? Because if people, for example, if you were raised a fundamentalist Christian, and you don't feel for whatever reason that belief system suits you anymore, and you are out there and you are looking for belief and you are looking for meaning and you're not going to find it. And who knows why that belief system doesn't suit you? I don't know. It could be your identity. It doesn't work. It could be that your family and you had something. It could have been that the particular church you were in was abusive. I know many Catholics who've left the church because of the litany of abuses, right? That has happened. So what can we create or how do we create some type of, and I'm not saying that we have to do it or it has to be a group project. I loathe groups and I love your focus on the individual in that sense is what makes you unique and interesting in the individuals. George Carlin had a great quote. He goes, I hate people. I love individuals. It was something to that degree. But, I agree wholeheartly that what you see on the left right now is a lot of people that are indoctrinating themselves into a new religion that is as oppressive, as unforgiving, and as detrimental as a lot of the tenets of old religion. But what can you do if you say, I don't want to be a part of that, but I also don't want to be a part of, sort of that, archaic, superstitious kind of, belief system that you may have grown up with.
That's what we're all trying to work out, isn't it? Is what we should do. I mean, your comments about Hitchens are very interesting to me because I would say in the main, I've taken his words seriously.
Right.
Is that I do believe that the truth of the biblical truth, for example, is a literary truth. It's not a scientific truth.
Right.
Science isn't about morality. It's about something else. Whatever the Bible is about, it's about morality. Now, you can debate the moral lessons in the Bible, but the Bible is an extraordinarily complicated book, so it's not that clear exactly what the lessons are, let's say. But having said all that, I've adopted a psychological/literary approach to ethical truth. And I've learned a lot about Christianity, for example, as a consequence. So, and a lot of that was from reading Carl Jung, who wrote a lot of what he wrote in response to Nietzsche's observation that religion was dead, that God was dead. Yes. And so Jung was influenced by Freud, but at least as much by Nietzsche. And he was trying to solve the problems that Nietzsche left. Well, you could, by definition, Christ is the perfect man. Okay, by definition.
Right.
Now, you can debate his representation in Christianity. That isn't what I mean. I mean, in some sense, I mean this. each of us has a relationship, whether we like it or not, with the ideal. No matter how obscure and unarticulate that relationship is, you know that because your own conscience will torture you. And the reason it tortures you is because you fall short of your ideal. It's there in you. Now, you have a responsibility. It's pretty much the nature of responsibility to manifest yourself in accordance with that ideal. There's no escape from that. Now, what we try to do collectively is to represent that ideal and to come to some agreement about what it is so that we can organize ourselves cooperatively and in productive peace. But there's no escaping from that internal dialogue with the ideal. I mean, every goal you have is a reflection of that ideal. Every aim you have, every belief in something worthwhile, all your conceptions that there is such a thing as truth, or your conceptions that there are good ways of acting and evil ways of acting, all of that presupposes an implicit ideal. And part of what our religious structures have done was focus on Christianity, is to try to make that implicit ideal explicit, to represent it, so that we can understand it more and more deeply, and so that we can also live out its dictates, let's say, more consciously. And we're always doing this, whether we know it or not. So, for example, you and I, to the degree that we're able to have this conversation in a manner that is genuinely reflective of a seeking of the truth, then we're manifesting a religious ideal in the context of the conversation. And that's why we're interested in it. And that's why other people are watching it.
Right.
And they don't have to know that. And they'll say, that was meaningful. That struck me. I learned something. I thought I'd watch for 5 minutes, but I watched for an hour.
Right.
We can't help it. This grips us. So, for example, you'll find yourself respecting or disrespecting people. Spontaneously, you'll find yourself in awe of someone or not, or contemptuous of them. All of that means that you're in the grip of a moral evaluation that's related to this implicit ideal. And, the more I've looked at the representation of that implicit ideal in religious texts, let's say, but in the broader religious culture, the more I'm struck by its profundity. So, for example, I use this story quite frequently, but the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis is very, very short. It's only half a paragraph long. It's very, very short. But it lays out very clearly the dichotomy of personality that exists inside the human soul. There's part of us, that part that's represented by Abel, that is striving towards the light, that's attempting to serve our own interests and the interests of the broader community, and perhaps the divine interest to the best of our ability, believing intrinsically in the basic goodness of existence. And there's another part of us that's rendered cynical and bitter and murderous by the tragedy of life and our sequential catastrophic failures and inability to put ourselves together and cruelty of the world. And that's humanity. All of us are caught in the battle between those two opposing viewpoints. It's religious to the core. And when we lose Christianity, let's say, we lose thousands of years of the attempt to make that implicit reality explicit. And that's a catastrophe. Sure. Now, we replace it quite quickly. We replace it with the Avengers universe, where we watch the battle between good and evil being played out in movies that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make and that push our computational resources to the limit. Think about that, The most sophisticated computational devices on Earth are used to generate artificial realities where we can explore the battle between good and evil. Right. And then we line up and pay, inordinate amounts of money to expose ourselves to this. And we find it gripping. Now, we write it off as entertainment. I don't write it off as entertainment. I take it seriously.